History on the Edge. I'm very excited to welcome our two speakers today. Here is Rory Archer, who is currently also a fellow at our institute for this month, and Goran Musić, who was very kind to welcome us in this presentation as well. They are both from the University of Vienna, from the Research Platform for Transformations in Eastern Europe, and will present what is in the results of their project on the socialist workplace in post-colonial Africa. So the floor is yours.
Very much for the introduction. So yes, what we're presenting today is titled "The Socialist Workplace in Post-Colonial Africa: The Yugoslav Workforce in Zambia." As a founding member of the non-aligned movement, Socialist Yugoslavia stood between East and West and fostered close economic, diplomatic and cultural relationships with decolonizing states in the Third World. And newly independent African countries like Zambia became Yugoslavia's primary allies in the global south. And in fact, Zambia was Yugoslavia's largest trading partner and its closest ally south of the Sahara. And so what our project does is that it examines Yugoslav companies' workforces in Zambia and explores some of the everyday dimensions of Yugoslavia's links with post-colonial African societies. And we're trying to connect class, labor, and race into studies of the Yugoslav region's ambiguous relationship to the global south through the lens of social history. So amid recently scholarly interest in state socialist Europe's global entanglements, historians have re-examined Yugoslavia's links with Africa to understand how Yugoslavia cast itself as a development and modernization expert, how Yugoslavs made sense of encounters with Africans, and how writers, diplomats, technical experts, how they put in Yugoslav non-alignment ideology into practice. So our focus, though, is on the Yugoslav workforce and their Zambian colleagues who work for Yugoslav firms and for joint ventures. So the largest Yugoslav workplace in Zambia was Energo Projekt, which you may or may not have heard of. It's a Belgrade-based engineering giant, and it constructed some of Zambia's flagship post-colonial infrastructural projects, such as hydroelectric plants, roads, government buildings, hospitals, and actually to this day this is still very visible in Lusaka, in the capital of Zambia. These sort of Yugoslav-era buildings dot the capital, and the kind of buildings which wouldn't be out of place in somewhere like Kragujevac or Velenje. And then Zambian Yugoslav joint venture ZECO. It was founded with capital from the Zambian ruling party UNIP and from Energo Projekt. However, the success of Energo Projekt and ZECO opened doors for other Yugoslav companies as well. Some of these were subcontractors on large projects, but also these companies were contracting their own deals. So this would include Konstruktor from Split, FAP Famos from Priboj, Partizanski Put in Belgrade, Energo Invest in Sarajevo, and some others as well. In terms of the numbers of Yugoslavs in Zambia, I mean, there are quite significant numbers of Yugoslavs and their families who were living and working in Zambia during this period. And I suppose the peak of this is the first half of the 1970s. The Yugoslav embassy in Lusaka reported that by 1973, there were around 2,000 Yugoslavs living and working in Zambia at the time. The figures fluctuate annually, and there aren't really kind of definitive statistics. But we estimate that the total numbers of Yugoslavs who were in Zambia, kind of, for at least a couple of months at a time, between say the late 60s and the late 1980s, was probably into the low tens of thousands. So it's not an insignificant number. The Yugoslavs abroad, they were not only highly educated white-collar employees, such as engineers and architects, but due to the lack of skilled manual labourers and the need for training of the local workforce, there are actually very many blue-collar workers working in Zambia as well. There's also kind of auxiliary staff providing services for Yugoslav work sites. So this would include cooks, drivers, different sort of administrative roles as well. So we can definitely say that the Yugoslav workers who were in Zambia, that they came from a range of backgrounds and from a range of different class positions. So some were white-collar, university-educated experts. Others were maybe kind of mid-level desk jobs or supervisory roles in construction sites. But probably the largest number in all was semi-skilled or unskilled blue-collar workers, particularly in the early 1970s. So they worked alongside local Zambian workers, training them as part of a broader strategy to promote the industrialization of the country. So of about 8,000 workers who were subcontracted by Energo Projekt and the building sites around the world in the early to mid 1970s. The largest proportion was to be found in Zambia, with around 3,500 Zambians employed permanently by Enigo Projekt alongside their Yugoslav counterparts. So in terms of our project team, so we're a 7-person research team. It's led by Goran Musić, and it's consisting of myself and Emanuel Haric, based at the University of Vienna. Recent graduates from the University of Zambia, Joy Piri and Texan and Juvo in Lusaka. And we have 2 more external collaborators, Catherine Baker at the University of Hull and Anna Calori, who's now at the University of Glasgow, but at the start of the project she was based in Vienna as well. And our Vienna team, which is myself, Goran and Emanuel, along with Anna Calori, we spent approximately 3 or 4 months in doing field research in former Yugoslav countries, so mostly in Serbia and Croatia. During last year and the year before, I think we spent a cumulative 4 or 5 months on 2 research visits in Zambia, so based outside of Lusaka. And this is sort of one of the ideas as well for the project, was that Zambia is a kind of a suitable location, and that English is the official language. There's access to archives, and it's relatively kind of safe and efficient to work in. And then in Lusaka, Joy and Texan are team members. They're still conducting field research until the end of this year. So now we're kind of at the late stage of the project, where we are in the process of simultaneously analysing primary sources and writing up the results. So even though it's quite late in the day, we're always welcome for some input or critical feedback on what we're doing with the project. And I think now I'm going to hand over to Goran, who's going to speak about methodology and sources and the state of the art.
Yes, so we have conducted oral history interviews with some 20 people, individuals in Serbia and Croatia, mostly former Yugoslav citizens who worked in Zambia, and their family members as well. Some 30 interviews thus far have been conducted inside Zambia, both with Yugoslavs who are still residing in Zambia, and also Zambians who had worked alongside Yugoslavs. And we tried to capture a diversity of perspectives. So we interviewed people from the contemporaneous political elite in Zambia, such as Mark Chona, Vernon Vanga, distinguished diplomats who worked with the Yugoslav state, but also Zambian workers with basic primary education or no education at all, who were employed by these Yugoslav companies and joint venture companies. When it comes to primary sources, the accessed documents include National Archives of Zambia, the University of Zambia Library in Lusaka was very helpful, but also the Diplomatic Archive of Serbia, Yugoslav Archive in Belgrade, of course, Croatian State Archives in Zagreb, but also we have consulted the National Archives in the United Kingdom to see how London at the time looked upon this activity of Yugoslavia in its former colony. Other important sources include the company periodicals, Enigo Projekt paper, visual sources from Zanis and Tanjug, the respective news agencies of Zambia and Yugoslavia, and very importantly, the personal collections of individuals who kindly shared these sources with us. So most of the photographs that you see in the presentation today are part of these private collections, pictures of families who spent time in Zambia. So a little bit on the state of the art in the field. So there is a recent surge, as you probably know, the studies of these relations, interconnections between the so-called Second and the Third World during the Cold War. And many of these authors focus on the ambivalent position of Eastern Europeans in the Global South at the time. So James Mark, for instance, reminds us that Eastern Europeans taught racially, that they were aware of the race, and they reflected upon their position in a global racial order in which their, I quote, commitment to anti-colonial internationalism had rendered them the better kind of white. Zoltan Ginelli evokes a theory of semi-periphery, semi-peripheryality to account for this in-betweenness of Eastern Europeans in the global South. So he uses the idea of semi-peripheral status, allowing the Eastern Europeans to occupy this double position. So when standing in relation to the global South, of economically less developed countries, they could take this position of a civilized white European. When comparing themselves to, for instance, their Western European colleagues, they could have put themselves in the position of a exploited, peripheral, and so on. So this duality is recognized by the Yugoslav scholars working with Yugoslavia just as well. So Peter Wright, for instance, notes that while non-aligned politics in Yugoslavia crafted a discourse that situated Yugoslavs as a part of the post-colonial third world, it existed alongside the language casting black Africans as racial others within a hierarchy of social, political, and cultural progress. Jelena Subotic and Srđan Vučetić are even more critical of the Yugoslav engagement in the non-aligned movement, viewing it as a, I quote, performance of solidarity, in which race was never an important analytical or political category for Yugoslavs. And of course, there are authors who take a different position. So, for instance, Nemanja Radonjić is critical of a kind of a direct translation of decolonial lens to Yugoslavia. He agrees that the Yugoslav lens might have been included in the broader European history of colonialism in a cognitive or consumerist way. However, he argues for a clear dividing line between the Western Europe and the Yugoslav space, which was never involved in the actual practice of colonialism, right? He claims that this paradigm of shared colonial history is without basis. These are works which are part of a broader process of forgetting of anti-colonial thought in Eastern Europe. And then, for instance, Anna Hoffman and Tanja Petrović deliver this type of critique further. They argue that past decolonial practices which were intrinsic to the history of 20th century alternatives and practices of solidarity are often rendered invisible in today's scholarship, which prioritizes teleological narratives of failure and structurally based arguments about race and non-alignment. So we asked the question, how can a kind of social labor history-based research contribute to these debates? And we want to take a step back and showcase how empirically based micro-historical study of Yugoslav enterprises abroad and a kind of study of Yugoslav-Zambian workers' interactions can offer new opportunities to understand Yugoslav frameworks of development, work, race in practice, on the ground, and thus add nuance of locating Yugoslavia's position within structures of global racial capitalism. In other words, we want to complicate the picture of Yugoslavs in the global South. We want to show how the experience of life and work in Zambia could differ depending on the class background, gender, age, knowledge of language, but also spatial location inside Zambia and the time period in which people from Yugoslavia were dispatched there. So, if we want to get a more complex picture of different situations, different living contexts of Yugoslavs in Zambia, it is useful to think about them in different periods of time and different spatial arrangements. We focus, as Rory explained, on Yugoslavs deployed by self-managed companies within the frame of the non-aligned movement, knowing that there are Yugoslavs before this in Zambia and also thereafter in the 80s in the present time. But we focus on these years, on these 2 decades, which were late 60s and the first half of 1970s are the prime years of Yugoslav presence on the ground. And these workers and employees, men and women, were concentrated in Lusaka, the capital city, where the company headquarters were situated as a rule, but also in different camps around larger and smaller construction sites across Zambia. And these camps, these living and working communities, were constructed to be largely self-sufficient, a kind of a mini Yugoslavia, people would often describe. So this means they had their own company-provided housing, a kind of bungalows or containers that you can see here on the picture. They had canteens, which cooked traditional foods from back home. They had sports facilities. If it was a larger camp, they sometimes, had projections of films, music evenings, entertainers visiting them from Yugoslavia every now and then, politicians, and so on. Even though they were meant to be largely autonomous, they were, however, not isolated from the local population, from Zambians. This is an important point. So, firstly, a large part of service jobs in these camps, in these settlements, were done by the local workforce. So, for instance, the chef in the canteen was usually from Yugoslavia, but all the other staff and waiters were Zambian. The same with cleaning staff, security, and so on. Secondly, the most important activity and space of interaction between Yugoslav and Zambians was, of course, the work site. So the majority of the workforce on these construction sites were Zambians, and Yugoslav workers, foremen, maistori, who they worked with them daily, side by side, and they often had the duty to train them, to skill this local workforce, and thus communicate with them. And last but not least, the leisure time. Even though these camps were physically separated from the surrounding communities, usually with a wall or a wire, the Yugoslavs got out, especially in the evening hours, and spent time in local bars, fraternalizing with local population, entering into romantic and sexual relationships with local women. The football teams of these companies were mixed. They had Yugoslav and Zambian players, and so on. Of course, the opportunities for leisure activities were limited in these faraway camps, these work sites. So it is important to differentiate between the white-collar staff and the directors, the management. They were privileged in the sense that they lived and worked in Lusaka, near the company headquarters. Their living situations were usually quite different from these workers. They usually lived in a house with garden, sometimes even a swimming pool. They could rely on Zambian cheap paid housework, so maids, gardeners, etc. They would usually own a car. And they could access expat infrastructure in these larger urban centers, so international hotels, clubs, embassy receptions, restaurants, and so on. However, if they had a car, these relatively well-paid whites, the Yugoslav workers from the construction sites, were also able to enter these places. They were not close to them. So car ownership was very important to be spatially and socially mobile. We will hear something more about cars from Rory. And indeed, the Yugoslavs were very dynamic, adaptable, and flexible in their social interactions. Both Zambians and the traditional white communities recognized them as such. They could spend the first part of the evening in a local pub and then move on to a casino in a fancy hotel. And in comparison to traditional white communities, who had kind of membership clubs, secluded spaces inherited from colonial times, or in comparison even to Chinese workers who were present in Zambia parallel to the Yugoslavs, also doing important construction work. For instance, the movement of Chinese outside of their work sites was strictly confined by the company and their embassy. And the Yugoslavs, on the other hand, were seemingly omnipresent. They were everywhere. They gave an impression that they were numerous and much more influential than they actually were. And this kind of makes me think of this useful observation from Alvin Rubinstein that he made in his book about non-alignment published in 1970. I think it really describes this quite well. He says, psychologically, they have proven highly adaptable and hardworking, often more so than at home. Not coming from a society with a high standard of living, they do not find the difficulties of adjustment to a society with a lower standard of living arduous, as do many from highly developed countries. Themselves heirs to a social revolution, they do not form closed or restrictive social circles. They mingle easily and widely. So if we want to think about these places where this kind of different type of interaction, this different type of whiteness could be practiced to a full extent, the logical place would be the work site, right? The kind of everyday work with Zambians that these people were involved with. And in order to describe it, to give you a feeling, a kind of introspection of the Yugoslav way that they saw it, we selected this quote by Radovan Dimitrijević, a construction worker for Energoprojekt. And it comes from the Energoprojekt paper. And he says, my arrival to the place of future housing settlement in Sikongo on the border with Angola resembled a parachute drop. We found ourselves literally in the middle of the desert without any vegetation, shade or water. For most Zambian workers employed on that construction site, that was the first time in their lives that they saw a truck earned a wage. Men and women walked around wearing only a single rag. They scared their children with a white man, came to touch me. In only 1 year, you would not be able to recognize them. Labor and steady earnings gave them new life. Preporodili su ih. I'm from a peasant family myself. I understood them well and helped them. So there's really a lot to unpack here. Just a few things that catch your eye instantly. So you have this kind of typical tropes of a white man in Africa, an explorer, right? So the climate is rough, the local population is primitive, they wear only a rag, and the kind of hierarchy here is quite clear, right? He is there to teach them. So this is clear, right? However, there are other layers here as well that I think are important to recognize. First of all, even though they are, in a sense, right, hierarchically positioned lower than Yugoslavs, they're not trapped in this state. So after a year, he's not able to recognize them. There is a potential in these Africans to transform, to modernize, to become kind of men and women who are emancipated through work, through hard work, with the help of course, friendly partners such as Yugoslavs. And this is, quite an important step out of the kind of colonial presentation of an African who is trapped in this vicious circle of underdevelopment. So Yugoslav is a kind of a benevolent modernizer here, and the whole discourse is very paternalistic, as you can see. He is a teacher, he's a father figure here, and things that make him especially fit or equipped to understand them and to play this modernizing role is the fact that Yugoslavia itself is a developing country, that he comes from a peasant background, that there are corners in Yugoslavia which kind of resemble Zambia, and they have transformed these conditions fast, so there's no reason why they cannot do this in Zambia as well. However, as I will show, this non-aligned paternalism was not always so benevolent. So he talks about people employed on site. So apart from these around 3,500 permanently employed Zambians for Yugoslav companies, whenever they would go to a certain location in in Zambia, they would employ day or monthly laborers, which would work as a kind of manual workers on these construction sites. And oftentimes, their position was quite different than those of Yugoslavs there or the permanently employed Zambians who arrived from Lusaka or other cities. So we came across, for instance, instances of strikes in these Yugoslav construction sites. So for instance, in this location of Kazungula in the south, close to the city of Livingstone, there was a highway construction camp, and the Zambian workers there threatened with a strike, and this became a kind of a scandal in the Zambian press. Some of the grievances that local Zambian workforce had is that they did not have access to all these amenities that I've just described of a Yugoslav camp. So leisure, medical services, and so on. And even if they had, and sometimes the Yugoslavs would open these facilities for the locals, but even then they felt that they were treated as second-class citizens. Just to give you an example, they would complain that the doctor in this local ambulance in the camp would take away the sheets or the mattress from the examination desk when the local Zambian would come for treatment, right? So Zambians found this very offensive, understandably, and they threatened with a strike. They even, called these practices, as racism openly. We also find descriptions of this in the Yugoslav sources as well. So, for instance, I will read you a quote from Jovo Bogdanovic. He was a journalist, a former partisan, and he made a kind of a journey through Africa and Yugoslav construction sites in Africa in 1969. And upon his return, he made a kind of a complaining critical report to the Yugoslav People's Army League of Communists. And we came across this document, and he says, "It is sufficient to attend lunch or dinner at the Kafue canteen, one of these major construction sites, only once, and witness the attitudes of some of our people towards the black waiters to conclude they lack not only cultured manners, but humane considerations altogether. With this type of behavior, we prove to be worse even than the Englishmen who were colonizers until recently. On the construction sites, our workers refuse to ride a bus together with the locals. On my long journey through Africa, I have found few of our countrymen who have faith in the black man, in his work capabilities and skills, even in far-away future." So it is important to balance this type of official presentation that you find in journals, in official presentation, with these type of documents.
Okay, so I'm going to speak about two Yugoslav men. So I'm going to revisit some of the issues that Goran addressed and bring up a few more as well. So the two men here photographed are Mića and Misha. So the older man is Mića. This was taken last year in Lusaka. The man sitting on the car is Misha, and this is from his own archive from the 1970s. It's the car he bought when he arrived in Zambia. So Mića both arrived in the 1970s. Mića always worked in the private sector, so he still has his own business, and he runs this. I think it's quite successful. He lives in a kind of a upmarket part of Lusaka with a with a big house, a swimming pool, and staff. Whereas Mića worked as a driver in Zambia in the 1970s, but he's back in Belgrade now. But he's still very animated by, and I think emotionally invested in Zambia, and so he's very willing to speak with us. And so we've done multiple interviews with these two men. So regarding their motivation to go to Zambia, so Branka Maksimovic, who was actually an Eneko Project psychologist, and she was tasked with preparing workers for foreign service, and she was discussing an interview about the pull factors, and the largest one was material benefit, which is basically higher wages. But there was also a secondary factor, which is the desire to travel and to explore. So this is also cited as an important reason. And I think for both Mića and Misha, the possibilities of both earning money and gaining life experience were intertwined for both of them. So I think the experience for being a young man in Zambia was very different to their compatriots starting work in factories in Yugoslavia at the time. So if we think of the kind of the normative expectations in the home community, things like settling down, getting a job after having served the army. So these kind of normative expectations, I think, were greatly lessened, and young male workers in Zambia enjoyed probably a far greater sense of freedom, adventure, of mobility. And again, maybe we won't visit it immediately, but I think in a longer discussion we could talk about the extent to how how colonial or neo-colonial these tropes are, because they do kind of rely on this sort of bank of knowledge and ideas about Africa and exploration, empty land, and so on. So. But going back to income, so these men would typically have a much larger disposable income, often paid at least partly in hard currency. So they'd earn more than their peers at Yugoslav factories at the time, and they also had much greater opportunities to engage in hedonistic practices. So Goran mentioned casinos, casual sexual relationships, going to parties, heavy drinking, buying cars, driving them fast, also driving drunk, sex and sex work. These are all themes that came up very frequently. So these are mentioned by people like Misha, and other men with whom we spoke with. But regarding cars, this idea of mobility came up a bit earlier. So Misha says that on his arrival to Zambia, and I quote him, he says, "I got my first paycheck on the 1st of November 1975, 850 kwacha, it's the Zambian currency. He says, I went to Kitwe, and from an Englishman there, I bought an Opel Kadett, second-hand, for 800 kwacha. With the remaining 50, I lived in the YMCA for a month." So as well as the opportunity to make money, this idea of exploration, adventure, I think are important tropes, particularly at the beginning of visits to Zambia, or beginning of kind of labor migration. Another issue is language. So both Misha and Misha arrived to Zambia in the 1970s without knowing English. And for many Yugoslavs, like these two men, it was their first time abroad, first time being on a plane. And they didn't speak proficient English, which is Zambia's official language. And in fact, the Zambian Review of Industry, Commerce and Communication observed that in 1968, the Yugoslavs working in the Kafua hydroelectric scheme seemed to pick up Bemba, a local language, much easier than English. And the journal noted that Yugoslavs had the reputation of being friendlier with Zambians than other Europeans, which was deemed actually a much more important factor in fostering good working relationships than language. So while most Yugoslavs who stayed in Zambia for a longer time did eventually learn English, it was often expected at the beginning that Zambians would learn some basic Serbo-Croatian, and this is according to a logic that because many Zambians were bilingual or even multilingual, that they were talented at picking up further languages. So Misha said to me, many Zambians learned our language very well, much better than you. So we were speaking Serbo-Croatian at the time, so it was a bit of a dig. And then Misha describes communication with the local drivers. So he was driving trucks on the so-called Hell Run from the Zambian Copper Belt to the port in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And I have the original Serbian quotation here, but a rough translation would be something along the lines of, "With the blacks, we communicated mostly because they learned some of our language, Serbo-Croatian. We did not communicate a lot. When we would get stuck somewhere, have to spend the night in the truck, we would then socialize. They would socialize with other black drivers and cook something together, and we would do the same with our countrymen, with Yugoslavs." So kind of revisiting this idea of race and paternalism that Goran brought up, I mean, as white Europeans in a post-colonial African context, Yugoslavs were necessarily racialized as white, which was, again, a kind of a novel experience, I think, for the majority of workers who hadn't worked in the global south before. But as we can also expect, young Yugoslav men actively racialized others themselves. For example, we can see, using the term Zambian and Crnac, or black person, interchangeably, as Misha did in this interview. But they tend to be very aware of the dynamics of colonial era race relations, at least in sort of broad, crude terms. And then they position themselves as Yugoslavs who are inherently opposed to this, to such exploitation. So, as Goran mentioned, James Mark reminds that Eastern Europeans thought racially, but at the same time their commitment to anti-colonial internationalism rendered them a better kind of white. And this seems to be the case with Yugoslavs in post-colonial Zambia, because they were keenly aware of their whiteness, but emphatically delineated themselves from the whiteness of former colonial Europeans, above all British. So Britain always comes as a kind of a yardstick against things to measure. So men like Misha and Misha, they routinely invoked the racist treatment of Zambians by the British in the late colonial and post-colonial years. So Misha says, for example, "The English forced the black man to respect the white man. Before independence, if a white man hit a black man on the street, he would throw a bit of money out the window and keep driving. The shops were segregated." So when we asked if Yugoslavs would take advantage of the position of being white, he said no. We were told to be very careful of that. And he says the Zambians were benign, dobročudni in Serbian, and they quickly learnt our language. So in contrast to the British, the Yugoslav workers perceived and presented themselves as this kind of benevolent trainers and facilitators of the Zambian workforce with the sensitivity to colonial legacies of exploitation and overt racism. So this was the official top-down Yugoslav way of doing things, but it also, I think, flowed down to the interpersonal relations with men like Mića and Misha. So they understood the role of being a sympathetic ally who could draw upon their own experience of recent and rapid industrialization in the difficult circumstances of the post-World War II years to help Zambians to develop as industrial workers. So to give a top-down example, we can see lots of instances of Enigo project workers or rather directors appealing to sympathetic understandings of the varied post-colonial context in Africa. So here we see the director Dimitri Goncharev saying a lot of love and understanding for African people. So engineer Slavko Štrbac, taking stock of Enigo project's work in Kafue Gorge about 7 or 8 years after the main development. He recalls Yugoslavs and Zambians working closely together and Zambians developing as workers in an interview in the periodical.
So the slide is the
slide.
Previous one.
Mm-hmm.
Previous one.
Previous?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So together with our construction sites, the Zambian worker progressed, learned how to mine, to concrete, to build, to handle machines, drive trucks, to lead other Zambian workers. I met them on the building site, shoulder to shoulder with their workers. They greeted each other like people who were aware of their new skill and new values. They waved from the high cabins of bulldozers, heavy trucks and cranes. We sat in the restaurant together. We ate Yugoslav food, cracking jokes at the Zambian waiter and communicating in a fortunate mixture of English, Serbo-Croatian and Neanja. So the understanding of Yugoslavia as benevolent socialist modernizer was shared not only by skilled workers like these kind of directors from Enigo Project, but I think it was also salient among ordinary Yugoslav workers and their families. So it's kind of traveled downwards. So Mića, speaking from the position of a private business owner, internalized his paternalist views in recalling his own experience in training and working with Zambians. He claimed that around 1,000 Zambians learned from him at his company over the years, working as drivers and mechanics, and looked at Yugoslavia in positive terms due to this experience. He says, they adored us because we looked at them as equals, not like other people and nations did. There was racial discrimination from others, but we looked at them like we were equals. They really respected that. They socialized with us and they learned a lot from us. So this then begs the question, so what did Zambians themselves actually make of Yugoslavs? Like, do their own memories of working with Yugoslavs in the 1960s, 70s, and up to the 80s, does this cohere with the kind of self-reflections and these sort of confident viewpoints of Yugoslavs like Mića and Misha? So, I mean, there are ample columns from the Zambian press that extol the virtues of Yugoslav self-management and Yugoslav engagement. But I think what's probably most illuminating are oral history interviews that our team undertook with Zambians who had lived experience of working alongside Yugoslavs. So these are people who worked in places like Zeko or directly in Enigo Project, who had, for many, many years had Yugoslav colleagues. So the sets of interviews conducted by the Zambian research assistants, that's Joy Firi and Texan Njuvo, these were done in English in town Nyanja without the presence of us, so without kind of, white Yugoslav associated researchers, and I think this offers some valuable insights. And actually the kind of the retrospective tropes that emerge consistently are kind of in line with a lot of the dominant Yugoslav self-perceptions of the day. So Yugoslavs compared to other Europeans treated Zambians more as equals, tended to be patient and forgiving trainers and colleagues. And then consequently, they're remembered quite fondly by the Zambian former colleagues. Now, I would emphasize as well that a close reading of Yugoslav sources, as Goran has showed, does reveal routinely patronizing, prejudiced, even sort of racist attitudes towards societies in the global south in general and in Zambia in particular. But this does pale in comparison, I think, to the virulently racist views in circulation in British diplomatic sources. Just to give one example, a diplomatic report from the British High Commission in Zambia in 1970 which features Yugoslavia in some detail. One J.L. Pumphrey of the British High Commission says, or describes Zambian people as, and I quote, still in general indolent, ignorant, drunken, xenophobic, fractious and irresponsible. So we find much more extreme representations in the British sources. But turning to the Zambian memories, so Michael, who was a former worker in ZECO, the joint venture company, he was born in 1955 and he had worked with British and Italian firms before starting work alongside Yugoslavs in ZECO. And he recalls, and I quote, compared to other Europeans, Yugoslavians were the best because I also worked with British and Italians. They, the Yugoslavs, would correct you nicely without yelling or embarrassing you. He stressed that he was thankful that the Yugoslavs did not segregate anyone, and through ZECO they taught him a lot of skills in the workplace, even though he hadn't completed primary education. So he mentioned a kind of a Yugoslav pedagogy of sort of teaching people on the go, of opening machines, of very hands-on experience where a lot of people would be involved. He also recalls that Yugoslav colleagues were very sociable and that they'd encouraged their Zambian colleagues to show them around town in the evening. He says, the Yugoslavs wanted to socialize with the Zambians. They would ask the Zambian foreman to take them to hotels, bars, and even to ask to find Zambian women for them. Another Zambian former worker with ZECO, Christian, he emphasized Yugoslav sociability, recalling that Yugoslavs were very social and learned to speak a bit of Nyanja. Narrators recall Yugoslavs sometimes as being heavy drinkers, living the high life in Lusaka luxury hotels, and asking the Zambian foremen on construction sites to facilitate liaisons with local sex workers. But it appears that memories of Yugoslavs as benevolent paternal figures in the workplace are the ones that appear the most enduring. So Christina, who was formerly an accounts worker in the head office of the Parastate Bus Company, the United Bus Company of Zambia, she worked alongside Yugoslavs in this position, and she maintains very positive memories of her Yugoslav colleagues. So I quote her, "They were very friendly people in the workplace. You never felt bullied or as an African put down in some way. You're working together. They are molding you. We don't know what the benefit was for them, but it was like they were just giving it. Yes, the general picture you had of Yugoslavian is not one where there's intimidation, not on the second level. You had this unity with them. You were intertwined, not separated. It is a pity they just disappeared like that. They were very good people. It is a good country." So this was the kind of the very positive assessment of Christina from her workplace. So in conclusion, I mean, some scholars have rightly critiqued some of the performative aspects of Yugoslav post-colonial anti-racism. And I think it's very clear from some of the empirical examples that we've been discussing that many attitudes or many aspects of Yugoslav behavior and attitudes were deeply problematic. And we can, find many examples of this. But I think that on the ground, these performative attitudes ultimately fostered material consequences, creating a small but vocal cohort of Zambians and Yugoslavs who, more than now 5 decades after the peak of Zambian Yugoslav collaboration in the late 60s and early 1970s, they retain a positive view of individual connections. These are connections which had a tangible, meaningful, and enduring impact on their everyday lives. So we're trying to kind of capture this in a balanced way, in a bottom-up way, trying to account for things which are problematic, but also to sort of, to recognize how people view this today in retrospect. And I think with this we can finish, and we'd be very glad to go into more detail, respond to questions or comments that you might have. So thank you very much.